Hello again. We are going to look today at lineocentrism. So under our module, you should see lineocentrism notes. And I'm also going to ask you to open up this article from the Journal of Epidemiology. We're going to briefly discuss it in the beginning, just a part of it. So looking at lineocentrism is what we're going to discuss today. And first, I'm going to ask you to read through the abstract for the article that I had you open, and as you do, I would like you to note your immediate reaction to the abstract. Any questions you might have would be good for clarification under our content discussion board, and then any issues with the conclusions made. So here is what the abstract looks like is just this section from here to here. Actually, it's obesity. Anyway, it's an obesity journal. Neither here nor there. All right. But go ahead and read through it and address these questions. All right. So take a second, pause the video, go through the abstract on your own, and then we'll come back and discuss via me talking to you. All right. So hopefully you've paused the video, you've read through the abstract, and we can look at answering these questions over the next few minutes. So first, I'd like you to draw what you think their graph for the obesity rate versus time looks like. In other words, what are they saying in that abstract for the overall obesity rate versus time? So go ahead and pause, sketch down somewhere what you think their graph looks like. So as I go through it, I see that, over time, they expect, right, we are at some certain obesity rate for all U.S. citizens, and they expect that increase, the recent increase, to continue in a linear fashion until at 2048 we're going to reach 100% obesity rate. All adults will be obese or overweight. Right? So my question is, do you have any problems with that? Right? What problems do you have with that mindset? Right? Take a second, pause it if you must. What problems come with that? Well, certainly, all right, and here's the passage I'm referencing, all right, in particular. By 2048, all American adults will be overweight or obese, and while black women will reach that state by 2034. Well, I hope to be alive and an adult in 2048, and for example, I hope to not be obese. I imagine there will still be professional athletes who are United States citizens. I imagine there will be many young citizens who enjoy different physical activities, also, perhaps servicemen who are, not allowed to be obese, depending on the service they're in. To say that the obesity rate would be 100%, right, is extremely powerful, right, and also not a good representation of reality. Right? Because hopefully we all are all around at 2048, and there will be dynamics of the population that by either occupation or just interest will not be obese. Another thing to focus on, another problem with this, is that they say 100% of citizens will be obese by 2048, and they refer to black women reaching that state by 2034. In other words, 100% of black women will be in the U.S. will be obese by 2034. Well, what they're doing is they're applying their model, all right, now, and then they're applying it to subgroups within the entire U.S. population. Right? However, there's a problem with that. If they do that, then black men actually do not reach 100% obesity rate until 2095. All right, because what they're doing is this line up here, for example, is looking at the increase in the total U.S. population and that obesity rate, all right, and they're extending it, in other words, averaged across all subgroups, and then they're extending it in a linear fashion. They did the same thing with black women, and now they do the same thing. If you do the same thing with black men, though, they will not reach 100% obesity rate until 2095, right? Because they happen to be a lower rate of increase than the average across all demographics, whereas, for example, black women happen to be a higher rate of increase, right? So how can black men not reach that 100% obesity rate until 2095, but all U.S. citizens will, right? And the problem here we're seeing here is that the tendency to use a linear model to address something that might not necessarily be linear in that same sense, or in reality. All right, and so if you want a good thing to do, a good question, you could pause right now and answer this question, or you could come back to it, is what do you think this trend will really look like across all population? In other words, do you think there will be some sort of threshold, for example? We flatten out and approach some threshold. Do you think there will be more fluctuation, perhaps a spike or a decrease due to some change in natural resources or earth science dynamics in terms of global warming or population migration? Right. So a good question might be, what type of graph could we actually expect, or what do you think that trend will look like? But so hopefully we see that being too linear minded or lineocentric can be an issue. So I want to highlight or hammer this idea home with some tax arguments. And so I'm going to briefly talk about what the idea of Swedishness is. And so by Swedishness right here, hopefully I've got the highlighter chosen. Let's see if I can figure it out. Yes. All right, by Swedishness here, what I mean is, what's typically meant is the amount of government services provided. All right, so we're going to talk about Swedishness compared to prosperity for just a second, and then we're going to sort of shift back to more of a tax-focused, specific argument. But so a country that is more Swedish would have more government services provided, whereas a country that is less Swedish would have fewer government services provided. Right? And so there are two arguments that are often made in terms of Swedishness and prosperity. And so my question is, which is the more reasonable representation of reality? Right? Is it this first one, where as government services increase, we would expect prosperity to decrease in a linear fashion? Or is it the second one, where as government services increase, we expect prosperity to increase, right, in a linear fashion as well? So some might say over here you've got, with this idea, with the first mindset, you might have freedom utopia over here, and the black pit of socialism, I believe is what Jordan Ellenberg says in his book. And then over here we might have something like the Thunderdome, as I like to call it. And then up here, where everyone for themselves. And then up here, you might have all you need is love, right? The communal living or something like that, right? So these could be two arguments for it, right? The problem with these two ideas is that there's only one direction you can possibly go in order to increase prosperity, no matter where you are, right? And although there are arguments for each side, right, it's not a reasonable reflection or representation, I should say, of reality, right? It's not very meaningful. And so there are other possibilities. So you can fill in, different types of graphs, that sort of thing. But perhaps one is more of a parabola, more of a curve, and maybe Sweden's over here on one side of the curve and US is over here on another side of the curve. One of the key things about this sort of idea, where we lose the sense of lineocentrism, we lose sort of our inclination to always look for lines, is that where you need to go now depends on where you are, right? There are two things I'm going to come back to, that not all curves are lines, and where you need to go depends on where you are. Okay. So in this case, right, this is the idea about tax activity, and we're gonna hone in on a little more, something a little more precise. In other words, in part B, I say, let's come up with a graph for the tax rate, x-axis, versus actual government revenue. All right, and what do you think that looks like? So take a minute, all right, pause the video and just sketch. All right, as we increase over here, all right, the tax rate, right, what do we expect to have happen for the government revenue? And I'll say the government revenue, and I might say specifically from taxes. All right, so go ahead and pause. And if you're joining me, we're looking at tax rate here versus government revenue from taxes. All right, in particular, we'll just look at this. So what might we think it looks like? Again, the idea of lines, right, a linear model, is probably unlikely. We might expect something more like the Laffer curve, which is a parabola that looks like this. It's a really good drawing right there, just a Laffer curve, right? And so a question, what this is saying is that as you increase the tax rate from 0, you might expect government revenue to increase. But then once you get to a certain level in terms of the tax rate, all right, you might expect the government revenue to, right, come back down, right, from higher and come back down to 0. So one question, a really good question, that could be a discussion question that I didn't add here, is that why are there, oh, here it is. Why are there x-intercepts on both ends of the Laffer curve? In other words, all right, of what I drew right here. We called this the Laffer curve, right? Why are there x-intercepts? In other words, do we come down and hit 0 on government revenue on either end? Right? That's a good question. All right. Another question is, well, what other types of curves we have? I drew a Laffer curve, but maybe it's not as even nice as that. In other words, right, maybe our curve looks something more like this. It's more jagged. Maybe there are certain peaks in certain areas. But one of the key things is that we don't have one of these linear models, almost certainly. All right, and reasoning is that where you need to go probably depends on where you are. If the tax rate is 0, you're not getting any government revenue from taxes. All right, if your tax rate is too high, all right, then many people just stop paying taxes. They can't afford to. Those who can afford to leave, right? Find safe haven somewhere else where the tax rate is more reasonable. All right. And so a good question that I posed as our discussion question number 2 is that why might this sometimes lead to jacking up taxes on the middle class? Right? Why might a relationship that looks like this or even this, right, but probably two more meaningful representations of reality in terms of taxes, either right up here or down here. I don't know what that was supposed to do. Right? Why might that lead to the dynamic of jacking up taxes on the middle class, right? In terms of, as opposed to on upper class citizens or on lower, in terms of upper class income or lower class income families. All right, so we're going to pause there. We're going to have a second video on lineocentrism, and from there we will continue. Over and out.